Hello viewers, welcome to CSEC Circle. And with me today, I have Sam.
Welcome everybody.
Nicole.
Hi.
And Winnell.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Once again, we're going to discuss and analyze poems. Today we're looking at the poem Bird Shooting Season by Olive Senior.
Bird shooting season.
Bird shooting season, the men make marriages with their guns. My father's house turns macho as from far the hunters gather.
All night long, contentless women stir their brews. Hot coffee, chocolate, Sarasi, rap poem and tailif for tomorrow's sport. Tonight, the men drink white rum, neat.
In darkness, shouldering their packs, their guns they leave.
We stand quietly on the doorstep, shivering. Little boys longing to grow up bird hunters too.
Little girls whispering, fly, birds, fly.
Today we're looking at bird shooting season, and I want to give you a brief background about the title of this poem. This season exists between August and September, and they gather to shoot birds such as the white-winged dove and the pea dove. Additional information about bird shooting season can be obtained from the website nepa.gov.jm/BS-2009. We're going to discuss a bit about the type of poem. Sam?
Traditionally, we are told that there are two large categories of poems. Narrative poems, namely the ones where the emphasis is on telling a story. And secondly, lyrical poems, the ones where the emphasis is on presenting the thoughts and the feelings of the speaker. Mm-hmm. This poem, as it were, falls somewhere unhappily between those two, I would say. Mostly it is a description of a particular occasion in the bird shooting season of whatever country it is. We may assume it's Jamaica because Olive Senior is Jamaican and she's the poet. But be that as it may, the poem really paints a word picture of what goes on a specific night during bird shooting season. So to me, it doesn't fit comfortably either in the category of lyric or narrative poem.
Thank you. The imagery that comes to mind as the poet emphasizes words such as Sarasi and hot chocolate and the rap poem and so on, brings that Jamaican image or memories of what the poem highlights. Winnell?
Well, I also think, in addition to the imagery that you mentioned, that there is, to some extent, war imagery suggested. I mean, when you look at the idea of bird shooting, you kind of think weaponry, and they do mention the weapons, the guns that they're going to be using. In the third stanza, they talk about their guns. But when we look at the end of the first stanza, where there's a suggestion of hunters gathering, certainly there is almost like the suggestion that there is some kind of war. Mind you, it is a war on birds, but a war nevertheless that is about to take place.
Nicole, can you share your thoughts on verse 2?
Verse 2 is quite interesting. It's the longest verse in this poem. And as you will see as we discuss further, there's a lot of work that the women in this poem do in preparation for bird hunting season. What is really interesting about this stanza, though, is the word contentless in this stanza, line 5. And that word contentless speaks to a possible interpretation in this poem that these women feel oppressed and that these women were quite resentful of the work they had to do in preparation for bird shooting season.
And Sam, we'll look at verse 3.
Well, the first verse would have focused on painting a picture of the men gathering at the person's home. The second verse would have looked at the preparations made by the women. And the third verse is actually the briefest, a mere 2 lines, and it talks about the men leaving to begin the actual hunt.
Sam, we're looking at interpretation and diction.
Well, if by interpretation we mean how we are to understand the poem in its totality and its emphasis, I would say that the first key word that guides my response to this poem is part of the title. season. By definition, a season is something that has a limited duration. So bird shooting season is not a reference to something that goes on from January to December in whichever country in the world this is. Let's say it's Jamaica. It means it's finite. So there will be other interpretations of the poem, but really the poet, as far as I'm concerned, is focusing on something that happens for a brief period of time. And the second significant word in my reading would be in verse 1, my father's house turns macho. And the key word here is turns, because that indicates to us that whatever this poem is painting a picture of is not the norm, is not typical, is not characteristic, is not what happens the majority of the time. So this is seasonal and brief in duration.
Okay.
So I'm sure that later we'll be discussing other elements of the interpretation, and I will pick this back up at that time.
Winnell, can we look at another aspect or another view of how the poem is interpreted?
Well, picking up from what Sam was saying about the seasonality of this whole bird shooting season, to me this poem has a kind of clear demarcation of gender roles. In essence, when we look at this poem, there is a clear divide between what the men are actually doing and what the women are actually doing. And so the idea of it being a season doesn't necessarily sit well with me. I'm thinking that perhaps the poet is suggesting something a little bit more than just this, because I mean, we've looked at Nicole, who said that these women were contentless, and what we're actually seeing is that these women are basically doing all the work while the men are basically sitting around drinking white rum neat. And then after the women have done all the work, they're taking up the same food that they would have prepared for them, their guns, and they're leaving as if they're going to do some important task. Now, I can't help but remember that perhaps it was like in the 1980s or so, women were referred to by Caribbean men as birds. And so you cannot help but think that Senior here is maybe in a very tongue-in-cheek way referring to women as birds in this poem. But I guess the others will put their own interpretation to it.
Okay. Well, while I understand the basis for Winnell's interpretation, I would want to suggest that might be reflective of perhaps too much education with an emphasis on redressing the imbalance between women and men in most societies in the world. But perhaps nature never intended men and women to be equal. There's a role for women and there's a role for men. If one is of a Christian persuasion, the good book does say in Genesis that God recognized that it was not good for men to be alone, and so he created women to be a help, meet or suitable for men. So clearly there's a role for women and a role for men. And traditionally in most cultures in the world over the history of civilization, men have been the ones who've been the hunters and the gatherers, who go off, who face the danger of the wild, who bring back food. We have expressions such as bringing home the bacon, and typically it's the man who brings home the bacon. And I would want to suggest that this poem reflects that reality that is so common in many societies over the history of humankind.
If I may, I would like to interject here, Sam. You know, one of the things that students have to consider is that perhaps the poets could be sending some type of message. There could be an underlying message behind the poem.
That's true.
And when we look, for instance, at the length of that second stanza, that's the longest stanza in the poem. And basically what we have is a whole listing of all of the tasks that these women had to do in order to prepare for men basically going off for sport. And they do mention sport there, tomorrow's sport, in that same second stanza.
Correct. And again, the nature of human life is that all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. We learned that in primary school, right? So There is a time for work, and there's a time to, as Shakespeare would say, recreate yourself. Relaxation is very important. Human life should be more than just drudgery and fulfilling one's obligations. So certainly I'm sure that in this country, in this community, as elsewhere in the world, there are things that women will do which will give them relaxation and fulfillment. But the poet has chosen to focus on something that men typically engage in. So it's just a matter of the poet's perspective and perhaps prejudice or bias.
Well, my colleagues are very passionate about their respective views, and I will say that I'm very intrigued with what Vinell had to say, because my first reading, I didn't interpret that at all. I would agree that the word contentless in stanza 2 does suggest a sense of burden, a sense that they didn't want to do it, a sense that they were resentful of it. But I also feel as though we have to be cautious how we impose our modern day experiences and interpretation of poem. I really do not see a feminist reading of this poem, and I think as women we're often tempted to see these things in that light. For me, I was just captivated by the poet who so wonderfully captured the essence of birds shooting season, and I think the last stanza for me is quite instructive. We stand quietly on the doorstep shivering, little boys longing to grow up, bird hunters too, little girls whispering, fly birds, fly. And I think the poet captures the nuances in the masculinity, those boys wanting to be like their dads, and the girls, the feminine nature of us where we want to nurture, they just want the birds to escape. So I will say that Vinell, that word contentless is there, but I don't see it in any way as deep oppression, just a resentment for that moment, and I see it more as just representing a particular time in Jamaica where they enjoy going out on this male sport.
And if I could follow on from Nicole, if one were to look at the structure of that final verse as well, there's a sense of balance there, I would argue, rather than something that is clearly intended to bias us in terms of siding with the women. So we have a common experience of standing quietly on the doorstep and shivering because of the actual environmental conditions. And then we have first the little boys with their particular desires, and we have the little girls with their particular desires. And almost equal words or space is given in the poem to the two of them without any obvious choice being made in terms of saying to the reader, you should choose this view or you should choose that view. So essentially, I guess Olive Senior might be very clever in writing a poem like this, putting in enough implications that those who are of a feminist persuasion, who want to champion equality for women and women's rights and redress the imbalance in society and civilization, can feel drawn to the poem. And then people like me who see this as basically, well, this is just the way it is, will recognize that this is a faithful reflection of how life is.
Sam, you were looking at the lineation.
We are told by scholars that poets make conscious choices. And lineation is something that often as students and teachers we may not pay very much attention to. We tend to focus on summary of the storyline or the experience. We tend to focus on the themes and the imagery and so on. But lineation may be an important dimension of certain poems more so than others. And perhaps it is the case in Olive Senior's bird shooting season. So if you were to consider the first verse, for example, bird shooting season, the men. If you think about that, that's not a logical place for that line to come to an end. If the poet had put bird shooting season by itself and then on the next line, the men make marriages with their guns, that would seem to reflect the sense of how you would deliver the line and the meaning. But from the very beginning, by ending lines in these unusual places, it seems to me that the poet suggests the disruptive nature of this experience. As Vinell would have said, and you agreed, and Nicole, the women are doing something and they're discontented or they're resentful about what they're doing, while the men seem to be very at home, literally and metaphorically, drinking rum without chasers and looking forward to the sport. So one could say that by ending lines with unusual words in unusual places, the poet is reinforcing the disruptive nature that bird shooting causes within families.
Okay. Renel, would you like to highlight the notion of capitalization?
Well, I'm just going to more or less reiterate what Sam has just said. What we've noticed is that you do have erratic capitalization throughout the poem. When we look at the beginning of the poem with bird shooting, then instances where, especially in the last stanza, you have little and then fly, birds fly, all are capitalized. And it's almost, especially with the last line, the fly, birds fly, as though it's like a slogan for the environment. I mean, given that we are talking about bird shooting season. But I'd like to put my little plug in it, and I'd like to say that that fly, birds fly in capitals, which seemingly the little girls are whispering, is about their own situation as young women who are like the birds to some extent, hunted by young men at some stage or stages in their lives.
Well, Winnell has a point to a point. The thing is that the complexities of human relationship are many. And while some people may be persuaded that women are perceived as prey by men who hunt them for, various things, again, one could argue that that is the nature of nature. So if we think about the animal kingdom, okay, we talk about animals being in heat. Their DNA predisposes them to sexual activity at a particular time for the continuation of the species. Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and that kind of thing. Now, the difference between animals and human beings is that we have minds which can reason, and we recognize that if we just acted on our animal instincts, we just went with our feelings and our bodies, we could create problems in our own lives. So we make judgments that, it's not good to have children while you're a teenager, wait until you're an adult, when you can provide for them materially, when your body is more mature and able to handle that experience, when you have a better understanding of relationships. But ultimately, the majority of the women, I believe research would confirm, still want a family, they want a husband, they want marriages, and they want relationships. So they may resent the manner in which men pursue them for relationships, but ultimately they still want a relationship.
Nicole, can you highlight a bit of stanza 3, which is like a bridge which separates the activity or creates the suspense in the
Sure.
poem?
Actually, I will take it from the top and talk about that as we go along. As we see from line by line, and as Benel pointed out, the different ways she ends the lines, Olive Sr. seems to experiment a bit with her form, and this is also borne out in her stanzas. Stanza 1 has 4 lines, stanza 2, 6 lines, stanza 3, 2 lines, and stanza 4, 5 lines. Now, we will talk about form because it's so important to how we perhaps analyze and interpret a poem. And we will ask ourselves, why has she written the poem this way? And the truth is, we don't know why she has written it this way. It does not necessarily bear upon the interpretation of her theme. So we're just going to suggest that perhaps she has some poetic license and she did what she wanted to do. As one of my colleagues said, perhaps it's a little bad writing. But I will go with the interpretation. Perhaps she was just taking a bit of poetic license. I also wanted to highlight specifically, though, stanza 3, because it's just 2 lines. And that's where we go to immediately when we see the poem. And this stanza creates a bridge between the ones that go before and the one that comes after. For example, the first 2 stanzas talk about the frenzied activities that the women undertake to prepare the men for bird shooting season. And this stanza 3 just says, in darkness, shouldering their packs, their guns, they leave. So we get a sense that these men are ready for the task. And then the last stanza tells us how the others, the children and the women, are standing looking on at them. So that stanza 3 creates a transition between the preparation and the men actually going on to their hunting.
And if I could complement what Nicole has said, I could say that one could see some kind of logic in what Olive Sr. is doing, as well as her exercise of poetic license. Because if you think about it, most of the work, as Winnell pointed out, in this particular event is being done by the women. So not surprisingly, the verse with the greatest number of lines is the one that describes all the activities that they're doing to prepare for the men. In contrast, the preparation actually done by the men is minuscule in comparison. There's very little. It's basically to pick up their backpacks and to pick up their guns. So you don't need several lines to describe that, because all the hard work, the time-consuming labor has been done in the preceding verse, which is the longest verse, by the women.
Okay. Renelle, anything to add?
Well, I hope that students are seeing that there is so much more to examining a poem, and that they are seeing all of these varying interpretations in our discussion. Because certainly the idea of just those two lines, for me, is a little different to what everybody else is saying. I'm seeing the two lines as the poet suggesting something about the men and their whole role in all of this. And to me, what is being suggested is that these men are perhaps aloof, indifferent, not caring, unaware of the fact that they are taking stuff that women would have prepared, and it almost seems thankless, and going off on a sport which really isn't that important. That is just my interpretation.
I think what Renelle is saying is interesting, and I want to jump off on something she said about interpretation, and that's why literature is so rich, because all of us here can read the same thing and come away with a different view on the matter, because I disagree with that interpretation of those two lines. And the truth is, you can read it, it comes down to emphasis, because if you read it very hard, in darkness, shouldering their packs, their guns, they leave, as opposed to slowing it down and saying, in the darkness, shouldering their packs, their guns, they leave, you get a sense that they're just preparing for the task at hand. There's nothing violent about it. It is just a strong imagery of how they're preparing to go. And I think it's just so beautiful how speeding up or slowing down your words could have a totally different impact on your interpretation. So these are the things, as Benel is encouraging you students and other viewers, that you can note the nuances and bring a personal interpretation supported by evidence to your reading of any poem.
Finally, the we is connected with the my in line 3 of stanza 1. And I think that the persona is male, a young male, who gets to see his father's house become macho during this bird shooting season time in Jamaica. Sam has a different take, and he feels that it's a trick of the poet. So he will highlight his take on that.
Yes. If you think about the diversity of interpretations that we have presented today, clearly there is something about this poem that does not lend itself to consensus or unanimity. Different readers come away with different things. And the most charitable way to think of this, the best case scenario, so to speak, is that Olive Sr. is a clever poet who's deliberately done this to provoke varied reactions from the readers. Now, while Roylin believes that the persona, the voice speaking to us is male, I don't believe that at all. I believe this is a deception, an illusion that prompts readers to pick a gender which they favor. Because actually, my father's house is a phrase that a girl could use or a boy could use. And secondly, when we come to the last verse, we stand quietly on the doorstep shivering. The verse then continues, little boys longing to grow up bird hunters too, which implies we are hearing the voice of a little boy. But then it is immediately followed by little girls whispering. So either we have no human being of any gender who is saying this poem, or we have some kind of androgynous individual who is both a little girl and a little boy, or we have a breakdown in terms of language use where the poet forgot that she was supposed to be standing outside of the poem and got confused and assumes the persona of both a boy and a girl, speaking both from the male perspective of wanting to be like fathers and go bird hunting, as well as the female perspective, sympathizing with the birds and hoping that they will escape death.
I will conclude by saying that this poem is open to informed personal interpretation. Thank you.